That's it. They're right outside the door. Let's go bring them. Sure. You want to come on inside so you don't have to walk through everybody here?
Hey, Will? Yes, sir. This is Rick.
What's your...
I can go check. It was just the media that was no, I think it's a 10. But we have lots of computers. I thought so. Yeah, it said approximately 10:15. And Charlotte thought it was 10:30.
The Crime Subcommittee and Government Surveillance Subcommittee is called to order. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge the passing of our friend and colleague, Sheila Jackson-Lee, a longtime member of this committee and of the United States House of Representatives. Ranking Member Jackson-Lee was first elected to the House 30 years ago, and she previously served as chairman of this subcommittee, and I had the opportunity to be her ranking member, and then we swapped positions, and it was always a cordial professional relationship. While we may not have seen eye to eye on every issue, on most issues, in fact, I admired her, and I appreciated her tenacity and commitment. We had many frank discussions expressing sincerely held positions. She was a fierce and loyal advocate for her constituents. She leaves behind her husband, her 2 children, and 2 grandchildren, and she will be missed by members on both sides of the aisle. Before we take a moment of silence, I'm going to yield time to Representative McBath.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, and I'd like to take a moment to honor my friend, mentor, and my sister, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee. She was a true powerhouse who fought for the betterment of our country and all its people. She was a genuine force to be reckoned with, always focused on making this country safer, more equitable, and more just. She was the first woman appointed ranking member of this subcommittee and went on to fearlessly serve as chair in the 117th Congress. Her leadership on civil rights issues will continue to be felt in Congress and all across this country. She uplifted marginalized communities, championed human rights, and tirelessly defended our democracy. As a mentor, Congresswoman Jackson-Lee showed me the ropes. She took me under her wing during my freshman year. She was one of my first friends on Capitol Hill and offered her support for me even before I came to Washington. And I thank God I had the chance to know her and receive her precious guidance. We served together as moms determined to make a better world. And I will do everything that I can in my power to keep that work going. I want to take this time to thank Congresswoman for everything that she has done for all of us, the least of us, the least of these, and for her fighting spirit to the very end. I am praying for her family, her staff, and for all of us feeling the impact of this loss. Sheila is one of a kind, the only Sheila Jackson Lee. I yield back.
Thank you. Let's pause now for a moment of silence to remember. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Nadler? Mr. Please, I yield to you.
Mr. Chairman, it's still hard to believe that we will never again see our dear friend and colleague Sheila Jackson Lee take her place on this dais. She ably led the Crime Subcommittee as chair and later served as ranking member. But no matter her title, she was always a leader. The mark she made on this subcommittee through her forceful advocacy for criminal justice, police accountability, gun safety, combating domestic violence, preventing trafficking, and protecting victims, and so many more issues will live on for many years to come. Sheila never let an opportunity pass to stand up for her constituents, and she was a determined champion for all those who are marginalized in society and who need her voice in Congress to represent them. I will have a little more to say tomorrow in the full committee, but I thank the chairman for recognizing me and for taking the time to remember such a valued member of this subcommittee, as well as a treasured colleague and friend. May her memory be a blessing.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. Chair recognizes the chair of the entire committee, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No one could get more out of 5 minutes than Sheila Jackson Lee. And she was a friend to everyone on both sides of the aisle, someone that we're all going to miss. I love what the chairman said. I think both he and the ranking member and Ms. McBath said it all well. So we're going to miss her. One of a kind, one of a kind. I yield back.
Thank you. Let's pause now for a moment of silence to remember our friend and colleague, Sheila Jackson Lee. Thank you. I'll now ask the gentleman from Wisconsin to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for an opening statement. I thank the members for coming to this morning's important hearing. Thank the director for being here. Today's hearing is titled Oversight of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The Federal Bureau of Prisons is a component of the Department of Justice, DOJ. BOP's mission is to protect society by confining offenders in the controlled environments of prisons and community-based facilities that are safe, humane, cost-efficient, and you want to keep talking? Okay. Let me, yeah. Yeah, just for a change, right? Okay, I'm going to try Mr. Gates. Maybe that'll help. So BOP's mission is to protect society by confining offenders in the controlled environments of prisons and community-based facilities that are safe, humane, cost-efficient, and appropriately secure, and that provide work and other self-improvement opportunities to assist offenders in becoming law-abiding citizens. At a time of rising crime, this is a critically important function. BOP operates 122 institutions and locations throughout the nation, and these institutions are operated at 5 different security levels in order to confine offenders in an appropriate manner. As of last month, BOP is responsible for the custody and care of more than 158,000 inmates and employs more than 35,000 individuals. 5.5 years ago, President Trump signed into law the First Step Act of 2018. The First Step Act sought to reduce the size of the federal prison population and reduce recidivism while still maintaining public safety. The Act's 3 main goals were: 1, correctional reform; 2, sentencing reform regarding penalties for federal offenses; and 3, reauthorization of the Second Chance Act of 2007. BOP is charged with much of the implementation of the First Step Act. As I mentioned earlier, we are experiencing a nationwide spike in crime, and it is vital that BOP gets this implementation right. The First Step Act required DOJ to develop a system for BOP to use to assess the risk of recidivism of federal prisoners and to assign prisoners to evidence-based recidivism reduction programs. These programs include literacy programs, occupational education programs, trade skill programs, and substance use disorder programs. Inmates who complete the recidivism reduction programming can earn additional time credits, which allows them to be placed in home confinement or an RRC earlier than they would have been. This is why I said BOP needs to make sure they get this right. We cannot allow criminals to be leaving our prisons early unless we can ensure that they will not reoffend. This subcommittee has examined the implementation of the First Step Act on a bipartisan basis since its passage, and I look forward to continuing that conversation today. However, there's a larger underlying problem that has persistently plagued the successful operation of BOP, including the implementation of the First Step Act, and something that BOP consistently grapples with, challenges of low staffing and high attrition rates, intensifying the risk in an already hazardous profession. As I mentioned earlier, BOP employs approximately 35,000 personnel across various prisons and facilities throughout the U.S. That is a 5% decline from the 37,000 personnel employed in 2020. Yet the prison inmate population has not declined. In fact, it has increased by almost 3,000 inmates. And I know that Director Peters is plainly aware of this persistent problem, and I look forward to hearing from her today on the steps that BOP is taking to address the manpower problem at the Bureau. There are a couple of other issues as well that I will discuss with Director Peters. First, I will discuss the treatment of BOP inmates, in particular impeachment witness Jason Galanis, which I believe has been politically victimized by the Biden-Garland Justice Department, the Federal Bureau of Prisons. If we look at this, in February of 2023, under the CARES Act, Galanis applied for home confinement. In March of 2023, U.S. Probation Office approved the residence for home confinement. In March of 2023, the warden at the FPC Pensacola also approved and signed off on the application. It then went to the Residential Reentry Management of Long Beach, because it was in that sector. In June 9th of 2023, RRM Long Beach approved the request and contacted SDNY, U.S. Attorney's Office, for their approval. On June 10th, OGR Committee here announced that it was subpoenaing Devin Archer, who was a co-conspirator of Jason Galanis and is awaiting his prison term. In fact, everybody of the 9 partners in that conspiracy all were indicted and went to prison except for one. One was never indicted, and that was Hunter Biden, although he benefited from that conspiracy and was a business partner. Near that June 12, 2023 announcement by the OGR Committee, the U.S. Attorney of SDNY, Nigar Tigais, gave, quote, strongest objection and threatened to go hard on this, close quote. June 13, 2023, BOP denied the Galanis application. June 22, 2023, Galanis was informed of the denial. He then appealed. August 8, 2023, his appeal to Pensacola warden on ground was denied on grounds that, quote, the amount of time he requested for home confinement, quote, was not appropriate, close quote. His appeal was denied. That denial, that rationale was not under the CARES Act. That was not appropriate to the CARES Act. September 22nd, 2023, Galanis appealed the denial to the RRM. And February 8th, 2024, we announced we were going to interview Galanis. And I will say, I thank the director for facilitating the interview of Mr. Galanis, who had been moved to FBC Montgomery, Alabama. The next day, the BOP Central sent Galanis his denial of his appeals. The new reason they gave was that the CARES Act had expired, regardless of the fact that he had applied for his change in confinement 3 months before the expiration of the CARES Act. And yesterday, we had a discussion, and I was told that the length of sentence, the high amount of restitution, and that he had violated conditions of release 8 years ago when he was out on bail. None of those are statutorily consistent with the CARES Act as well. And the point I'm trying to make is this is not unique to Mr. Galanis. Perhaps, I don't know, but I will say that this is a problem. On September, and we moved to this, despite the fact that Hunter Biden was a key partner in the same crime, DOJ failed to hold the president's son accountable. Mr. Galanis provided testimony, both transcribed and a hearing before the Oversight Committee as part of the House's impeachment inquiry. Mr. Galanis has alleged several instances of mistreatment since his incarceration, including repeated abuse from a BOP employee and DOJ intervening to deny him his home confinement. Second, on May 6, 2024, Representative Gates informed the House of Representatives that BOP Director Peters had denied his request to meet with Dr. Peter Navarro, who at the time was in custody. I also joined Mr. Gates and wanted to meet with Dr. Navarro. On May 9th of 2024, I, along with Chairman Jordan and Representative Gates, sent a letter to Director Peters requesting her testimony before the committee, which is why she's before us today, and we're grateful for her being here. Dr. Navarro served a 4-month sentence at BOP facility in Miami, Florida, after being charged and found guilty of refusing to comply with the subpoena issued by the partisan illegitimate House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, and was released just last week. Director Peters allegedly denied Representative Gates' request because Dr. Navarro was, quote, too notorious, close quote, to meet with a member of Congress. We'll hear more about that today, I am certain. Additionally, I informed the director yesterday, and I want to make sure to reiterate today, we have a strong desire to go and visit the Danbury, Connecticut minimum security facility, and hope to do so in the next few weeks. I look forward to discussing these issues and more issues with Director Peters, and I again thank her. She's been cooperative. She's always been communicative with me, and we may have disagreements, but we always talk about those. So with that, I'm going to yield back, and I'll recognize Ms. McDatt for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, and thank you, Director Peters, for coming before us today, and we really appreciate your willingness to answer our questions. The Federal Bureau of Prisons' significance within the federal criminal justice system contributes to the overall public safety of our country by not only housing individuals who have been convicted of federal crimes, but also by providing those individuals with the tools and skills they need to successfully re-enter their communities. In recent years, BOP has faced numerous challenges, including the sexual abuse of inmates by staff and other widespread employee misconduct, chronic understaffing, numerous incidents of violence and inmate deaths, implementation of the First Step Act, and a crumbling infrastructure. Director Peters, I do want to thank you, though, for the significant strides that you've made towards addressing each of these issues, which existed long before you ever began your tenure. However, these problems are still remaining, even if to a lesser extent. I urge my colleagues to use today's hearing to focus on what this committee and what Congress can do to ensure that the director has the tools, resources, and support that she needs to address agency deficiencies, maintain the safety and wellness of inmates and staff, and prepare inmates for their release back into society. I am encouraged by Director Peters' commitment to upholding the highest ethical standards among BOP staff members, and her dedicated efforts to change the culture at the BOP. However, we need to talk about the misconduct among BOP employees, which I understand is a very complex problem requiring increased scrutiny on management and comprehensive solutions with robust oversight and a transparent disciplinary process. In November 2021, we were shocked to hear about the reports at least that 100 BOP employees had been arrested, convicted, or sentenced for crimes over a 2-year period. And if that report wasn't shocking enough, we soon learned of the disturbing atrocities occurring at FCI Dublin in California, a federal women's prison known among inmates and staff as the Rape Club. Inmates at the facility were subjected to forcible rapes, forced sexual activity, inappropriate sexual contact, and other abuses at the hands of staff, made all the worse by acts of retaliation for speaking out and cover-ups by BOP staff and the officials. While our justice system successfully convicted 7 corrections officers, including the prison's former warden, and sentenced the offenders to prison for sexually abusing inmates, in April, we were made aware of the chaotic future of the transfer of FCI Dublin inmates to various facilities throughout the country following closure of that facility. FCI Dublin is just a sampling of the corruption, of the abuse and misconduct that has persisted at BOP for
Subcommittee on Crime and Federal Government Surveillance is called to order. Thank you. At this point, Chair recognizes the gentleman, ranking member for the entire committee, Mr. Nadler from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when Director Peters appeared before this committee just 7 months ago, I noted that oversight of the Federal Bureau of Prisons is one of the committee's most critical functions. I detailed the numerous deeply rooted problems that Director Peters inherited when she took over as BOP Director in August 2022. Problems such as chronic understaffing, rampant sexual assault, and inadequate medical and mental health treatment. Problems that will take time and resources to address. Yet the majority invited Director Peters just months after our last BOP oversight hearing, when it would be unrealistic to expect anything more than incremental progress in addressing BOP's most serious issues. They did so not because they actually care about those issues. Instead, my Republican colleagues are using this hearing to pursue their long-standing and frankly inexplicable obsession with Hunter Biden. They've called Director Peters here today primarily to complain about BOP's alleged mistreatment of an incarcerated felon, Jason Galanis, who testified for Republicans in one of their failed impeachment hearings. Mr. Galanis, who gave that testimony from federal prison, was a former business associate of Hunter Biden who has made all kinds of unfounded allegations against him. It is no surprise, therefore, that the majority has decided to waste precious committee time and resources attempting to bully the BOP into granting Mr. Galanis' request for compassionate release, even though BOP policy clearly calls for denying this request, as Director Peters will explain. Yes, that's right. In service of their convicted felon presidential nominee, the majority is using its oversight authority to champion the cause of another convicted felon, one who is serving a sentence of more than 15 years in prison because he defrauded, among others, an impoverished Native American tribe to the tune of over $80 million. I also expect that we will hear concerns today about the BOP's alleged mistreatment of certain January 6th insurrectionists. I welcome the newfound interest of my Republican colleagues in conditions at BOP facilities, but I hope that their concern will also extend to the thousands of other inmates, disproportionately people of color and from low-income communities who do not have the ear of politically connected individuals and elected officials. BOP reform could be an area of true bipartisan cooperation, but only if we recognize that all inmates deserve fair and equal treatment. Since Director Peters' appointment nearly 2 years ago, she has used her decades of experience to start the long and arduous process of addressing the staffing shortages that BOP has faced in recent years, the crumbling infrastructure of our nation's prisons, and the rampant sexual and physical abuse of inmates at the hands of more than a few bad actors at the BOP. Since she was last here, for example, Director Peters took the drastic but necessary step of permanently closing FCI Dublin, a women's facility plagued by sexual abuse. She has also taken agency-wide measures to punish and prevent employee misconduct and to change staff culture to ensure that we never again see the type of abuse that we saw at Dublin and other facilities. But sexual abuse is not the only threat to inmate safety at BOP. A February 2024 report by the Office of the Inspector General found that systemic operational and managerial failures contributed to hundreds of inmate deaths that occurred between 2014 and 2021, the period preceding Director Peters' appointment. More than half of those deaths were suicides. Others were attributable to lack of medical or mental health treatment or the presence of illegal drugs and other contraband, issues that are compounded by the staffing shortages that have plagued BOP since former President Trump instituted a hiring freeze from 2017 to 2019. Last year, Director Peters told us about the steps she has taken to improve employee recruitment, training, and retention to ensure that our nation's prisons are fully staffed with trained, experienced officers who are committed to protecting and serving the inmates in their care. I also hope that Director Peters will have an update on BOP's continued reliance on solitary confinement, otherwise known as restrictive housing, which takes a devastating mental toll on inmates. I do want to note that BOP has continued to make progress in another critical area, implementation of the First Step Act in recent years. In recent years, BOP has substantially expanded the programming available to inmates and has improved the process of calculating the time credits inmates earn for completing rehabilitative programs. This has helped to ensure that more inmates receive the FSA credits that they have rightfully earned. But as with other issues BOP faces, there is still so much more to be done. Due to our reliance on over-incarceration, coupled with the refusal to adequately fund the programs necessary for rehabilitation, the demand for these programs still outweighs their availability. And many inmates who have earned FSA credits still remain in custody, even though they have enough credits to be released early to a residential reentry center, simply because there is not enough bed space in those residential reentry centers. This is a problem that must be addressed, particularly since the evidence shows us that this programming works. Inmates released early due to FSA earned time credits have a dramatically lower recidivism rate compared to inmates who do not participate in these programs. As I said, rigorous oversight of the BOP should be a bipartisan issue. BOP's inmates come from all of our districts, and they will be rejoining all of our communities when they are released. They must be treated with dignity and fairness. They must be kept safe, and they must be given the tools necessary to become productive, responsible, hardworking citizens when they are released. I look forward to hearing from Director Peters, and I hope to engage in a productive conversation to ensure that BOP continues to improve under her leadership. Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witness, Ms. Colette S. Peters. Ms. Peters is the Director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. She was sworn in by the Attorney General on August 2nd, 2022. She oversees 122 Bureau of Prisons facilities, 6 regional offices, 2 staff training centers, and 22 residential reentry management offices. We welcome our witness and thank her for appearing today, and we'll begin by swearing you in, Director. If you'll please rise and raise your right hand. Okay. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? I do. The record will reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You've been seated, so that's good. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony. Keep it to 5 minutes. I believe there's a clock somewhere close where you can see it. You might hear me knock a little bit when you get to 5 minutes, indicating to please wrap up. But thank you, Director Peters. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule and go to you first for your opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Biggs, Congresswoman McBath, and members of the subcommittee. I first also want to offer my sincere condolences for the loss of your colleague. Yes. Is that better? Okay, I'll start over. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Biggs and Congresswoman McBath, and members of the subcommittee. First, I too would like to offer my sincere condolences for the loss of your colleague. I am grateful for the conversations I have had with her, and her fierce advocacy and accountability for the Bureau will be missed. And I am honored to be here today representing our employees, who are dedicated and courageous corrections professionals, committed to our mission and the agency's core values of accountability, integrity, respect, compassion, and correctional excellence. Nearly 2 years ago, I took the helm knowing that it was a struggling agency and that it would take time and resources to make positive change. What I found was that our recruitment and retention crisis and our dilapidated facilities are at the core of nearly all of our challenges. Low staffing levels impact our institution's operations, including safety and security, medical care, education, programming, and treatment. So our priorities are clear: recruitment, retention, employee wellness, and maintenance and repair. Fortunately, we are making progress with our recruitment and retention crisis. When I joined the Bureau, we had 986 new hires for that entire calendar year. Already this year, we have onboarded over 1,400, and the even better news is that we are now hiring more people than are leaving the agency. Yet challenges remain. The bottom line is we simply do not pay our people enough. Our average base salary of $55,000 for new officers is not competitive. So even when we onboard people, some leave for better pay. As an example, at our facility in Massachusetts, one of our officers left because he got a better offer with better pay at the local grocery store. Ads in New York City offer corrections positions that pay $130,000 after 3 years, where our federal officers make tens of thousands of dollars less. And our staffing crisis is very expensive, as we rely on overtime and augmentation and incentives to keep our prisons operational. Last year alone, we paid more than $128 million in incentives and spent more than $350 million in overtime. I also want to note the human cost of overtime and augmentation, which we know are incredibly difficult on our corrections professionals, both their physical and their mental health. So incentives like augmentation, recruitment and retention incentives, and overtime should only be short-term fixes. To solve our long-term problem, we are working closely with the department and OPM to create a special salary rate for employees in our institutions. The request, if approved, will require your support, and we estimate the need for an additional hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Our dilapidated infrastructure also affects our mission. It impedes our ability to offer safe, normal, and more humane environments for our employees and those in our custody. That number is now over $3 billion in maintenance and repair needs, and that tells you our infrastructure is crumbling. We have created a 5-year plan to attack the most serious repairs first and are preparing our 10 and 15-year plans. Before I conclude, I want to celebrate the passage of the Federal Prison Oversight Act. This act enhances our ongoing collaboration and good work with the Office of the Inspector General. I share the Inspector General's and your commitment to greater accountability and oversight, and have said so from day one on the job. I would like to thank Representative McBath for her leadership on this legislation and her acknowledgement on the House floor of our brave men and women and the need for additional resources to improve environments for them and those in our care and custody. I also want to thank every member of this committee who supported this legislation. As I have mentioned publicly, we will need more resources to implement this act efficiently on a couple of fronts. The legislation limits the Bureau's use of augmentation, and while I agree wholeheartedly with the sentiment of limiting augmentation, today in the midst of our crisis, without augmentation, we will need to mandate more overtime, which will not only cost tens of millions of more dollars, but again, I will note the human cost and the physical, mental wear and tear of our employees. We will also need to hire additional employees to effectively respond to the additional oversight and make that meaningful, long-lasting change. All of us at the Bureau, including our national union, look forward to working with you closely to ensure that we have the needed resources to uphold our end of the bargain. As I have said before, I believe in good government, accountability, transparency, and the importance of oversight. Thank you for your time, and I stand ready to answer your questions.
Thank you, Director Peters. Now we'll proceed under the 5-minute rule with questioning. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Director Peters, do you remember telling me that Peter Navarro was too notorious when I wanted to interview him during his incarceration?
Congressman, we had a long conversation about your desire to have us help facilitate Mr. Strand to appear on your podcast.
Nope. This is Navarro. So I'm asking about Mr. Navarro. Do you remember telling me he was too notorious?
Oh, sorry. Congressman, yes.
Okay, all right, so I want to get into how you determine that an inmate is too notorious for an interview or not too notorious for an interview. What is the standard that you apply?
So, Congressman, I think it's really important for the committee to understand that the request was about him appearing on a podcast. It wasn't about facilitating a meeting with the two of you, which my office
Correct.
followed up and said we would clearly facilitate. And there's only one avenue, as we talked about in our policy, around being able to appear on a podcast, and that's our media policy. And you, with your personal podcasts, that is not
it's my official
media.
podcast. So members of Congress do podcasts to function as video newsletters to tell the American people what's going on. So I wanted to interview Navarro. You said he was too notorious. You've acknowledged that was the basis. So I want to know now what test you apply to determine that someone is or is not too notorious.
Again, Congressman, while I shared that information with you in a one-on-one briefing, the crux of the denial was that we were not able to help facilitate an incarcerated individual to appear on a podcast.
No, that wasn't what you said. You said it was, I mean, you acknowledge it was this notoriety factor. And the reason I ask is because Michael Avenatti gave an interview from federal prison. So I guess, like, why is it that Michael Avenatti is authorized to do an interview from federal prison, but Peter Navarro isn't?
Congressman, I met with you to be as helpful as possible to
That
discuss.
wasn't helpful. No, because here's what it looks like, okay? You've acknowledged that the reason you didn't let me interview Navarro was because you said he was too notorious. And then I've spent more than a minute trying to get you to explain what the test is for that notoriety. And you can't explain one. You just keep going back to, well, we couldn't facilitate you and we're trying to be helpful. That wasn't helpful. And when you have standards that are subject to just any interpretation you want, then you carry with the entire Bureau the belief that you guys are just being arbitrary. Because like when John Gotti is allowed to do an interview from federal prison and Peter Navarro isn't, it's hard to ascertain how Gotti would be less notorious. And it just sort of it animates the concern that you heard expressed by the chairman, whether it's Galanis or Navarro or Bannon or whomever, that you guys are trying to make it harder on people who are expressing views that you don't particularly like. And so, you know, that's going to be we're going to have to put into law or oversight or something the ability to get to these people, because we're not going to accept just you making a determination that Avenatti's not too notorious, but Navarro is. So you heard the chairman say in his opening remarks that we want to go to Danbury Prison in Connecticut, and we want to go there to see Mr. Bannon. So is there going to be any problem in the next few weeks approving a visit with the chairman of this committee to go to Danbury?
As the congressman and I talked about during a one-on-one conversation yesterday, and as I will say to the committee, we will be happy to review that request and make that accommodation as you submit that request to the Office of Legislative Affairs.
Okay, I appreciate the commitment to review it, but are you committing to approve it?
Congressman, those approvals actually happen through the Office of Legislative Affairs. I can't foresee an issue with the approval of that, but
this is a legislative affair. You're testifying before your Oversight Subcommittee. So why don't you just tell us that you'll approve our trip to go to Danbury?
That approval rests with the department. We have a long-standing process
You lead
of
the
reviewing.
department. There's not some other person. You're the head of the department. Why can't you just say we can go?
We have a long-standing process of those requests being reviewed by the department, and I will encourage my team to work closely with the department in reviewing that request.
That is just a total non-answer. I mean, this is what we get, Mr. Chairman. This is what we get. Arbitrary standards, non-answers, and frankly, if we continue to fund it and tolerate, it's all we're going to get. So I would encourage some robust oversight here. I would not want to be in a position where you guys denied this request. Finally, I would just say with my final few seconds, Mr. Biggs and I were in really one of the most impressive prisons in the world, Sacat in El Salvador, and there was concern expressed by the Minister of Justice there that the Mexican mafia is operating out of our prisons, and they're able to conduct criminal enterprises and use communication capabilities. And so I hope you would just take for the record perhaps a review of what the Mexican mafia's activities are, and I'd love to hear about it. And finally, just want to echo everyone on the committee's very thoughtful and appropriate remarks about our colleague Sheila Jackson-Lee, and it only seems appropriate to offer that after the gavel has been rung, because that's when Ms. Jackson-Lee did some of her most outstanding work. I yield back.
She and I talked about that frequently. So the chair recognizes now the gentlelady, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Peters, the grotesque actions at FCI Dublin is an extreme example of why every person needs oversight. Every prison needs oversight. I back its closure 110%, and closing the facility was the first step in a long and harrowing process. The women at that prison remain in need of supervision, protection, and a sense of what their futures would look like. They've already endured so much, and it's your job to ensure that no additional harm comes to them. Many of these women held at FCI Dublin have family members and loved ones who are concerned for their physical safety and their emotional well-being. What steps were taken to screen for histories of misconduct among the temporary staff BOP brought to FCI Dublin to facilitate the transfer of adults in custody?
Thank you, Congresswoman. There was a review by the regional directors to ensure that the people we were sending to have additional eyes and ears in that facility during that closure were the appropriate people. We also brought in additional members from the regional office to have that oversight as well. Safety and security of those women and fear of even perceived retaliation during that move was top of mind for us.
Thank you. And what oversight is occurring to ensure that women are being treated humanely during their transfer process?
So on a variety of levels, we sent out clear messages to the wardens that they would have direct eyes and ears and watching these women as they arrived in their receiving institutions to ensure that they had the medical care, the mental health care, access to counsel, access to their family. You're right, we were worried about their families as well. We also have an individual that has been the liaison with our SAFER teams from the department, from the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, and she too is keeping watch on these individuals, so we have someone in central office paying attention. I also had the opportunity to visit a group of these women who had been transferred to our facility, our CTAC facility in Washington, and talk to them directly to ensure that their transition was going smoothly.
And did BOP evaluate every woman's eligibility for early release or release to community placements with consideration for good time credits and also the First Step Act credits and the Second Chance Act before assigning them to another facility?
Congresswoman, we did. In fact, at the time that we decided to close the facility, there were over 600 women at that facility, and at the point of moving them out, we had 518. So a substantial number of them were able to go to the community based on those earned time credits or other standing. Also, the women that I mentioned that were housed at CTAC, those were individuals that had less than 5 months remaining on their sentence. We wanted them to be as close to their releasing facility as possible during the latter part of their sentence.
And finally, what efforts were made to ensure that other BOP facilities had the capacity to receive those individuals that were transferred from FCI Dublin?
Yes, we did a careful review of capacity and their ability to safely absorb them and felt comfortable with the institutions that we had chosen that they would able to safely absorb them and provide them the appropriate treatment and programming and medical and mental health.
We've also been kind of concerned about the fact that we understand that some of the individuals that were transferred very far away from their communities and far away from their families with no notification of those family members as to where their family and those individuals were being transferred to. I myself, also having the murder of my son's child actually placed in federal prison as well, I will tell you our rights were violated because that gentleman, I will call him a gentleman, actually was transferred, and we never knew anything about it. I found out from the media that he had been transferred out of the state of Florida to another facility.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I know you and I have talked about that unfortunate incident, and I'm just, again, sorry that that happened to you and your family. The families were also a concern of ours in this move. For safety and security reasons, we can't give advance notice on when we're moving adults in custody ever, not just the temporary closure of a facility, but even the daily moves that we make, which is why we made sure that they had access and ability to reach out to their families once they arrived at their receiving institutions.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
General, the Yields Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you. Director Peters, the ranking member, said it very well in her opening statement that everyone should be treated with dignity and respect, and I'm assuming that applies to all inmates. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Derek Chauvin in a Tucson facility was stabbed. Derek Chauvin in a Tucson facility was stabbed 22 times while he was copying documents. What happened?
Congressman, excuse me. I won't be able to speak to the details of that situation for obvious reasons, but I will tell you that the safety of all individuals in our custody is what we do every day. That's our mission. That's our focus.
So the gang member that stabbed him 22 times seems now to have full access to being able to, for example, copy documents, stuff like that, while Mr. Chauvin is not allowed that privilege currently. Why would there be disparate treatment like that?
Congressman, I wouldn't be able to speak to the specifics of Mr. Chauvin's incarceration or the assailant. What I can tell you is that we have experts who make housing determinations and placements to ensure that people are safe and secure, both the individuals that were assaulted and the assailants.
Are you aware that Jason Galanis reported to Bureau of Prisons chaplain that he was the victim of repeated incidents of sexual harassment at the hands of BOP staff?
I am familiar with Mr. Galanis' allegations, yes.
Is that staff member who assaulted Mr. Galanis, is he still working for Bureau of Prisons?
Again, that's an ongoing investigation, and I wouldn't be able to speak to the alleged individual's circumstances right now.
You know, Mr. Chairman, this is really I've just been here 4 short years. This is really one of the frustrating things. When people come before this committee, whether it's the FBI, the Department of Justice, whomever, we rarely get answers. And you can see why the American people are losing faith in some of our institutions when we can't even get answers to some of these things. I just want to close with this question, Director Peters. In Wisconsin, recently, we had a staff member that was killed at the Lincoln Hills juvenile facility, and I don't expect you to know the details in regards to it. But a judge restricted use of restraints for violent youth due to an appeal by the ACLU. Do you ever run into the same problem where, as a result of the actions of the courts, that they restrict the ability to protect staff?
Congressman, I'm not aware of any examples.
So you believe your staff is well protected?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the question.
Do you think your staff is relatively safe in the environment that they work in?
I think that the important thing that we do every day is work to train them, make sure they have the tools and the resources they need to operate safe and secure prisons.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for giving me the latitude where I'm morphing into a state issue, but it's very disappointing now. A staff member, a very good staff member, was killed in a facility that that lives in my district as a result of a judge who took actions that allowed the inmates to run the asylum. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the whole committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In April 2023, GAO placed management of the federal prison system on its high-risk list in part due to staffing challenges. In which positions are vacancies most acute?
We're focused mostly on our correctional officers.
And what is your short-term and long-term plan to increase the number of correctional officers to meet the needs of the system?
Thank you for the question. We have done so many things. We've used every incentive that we have at our fingertips, both recruitment and retention incentives. We've changed how we're marketing and trying to hire our correctional officers. We increased correctional officers' base salary by $2,000. We waived the maximum age entry, from 37 to 39. We pay a $1,000 recruitment bonus to any employee that successfully recruits someone and brings them onto the Bureau. And as of May 2024, we received direct hire authority for our correctional officers nationwide, which has proven very successful. And then, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think the primary focus is really that base salary and working with the department and OPM for a special salary rate.
Thank you. According to GAO, some of the staffing concerns relate to difficulty recruiting, while other challenges relate to what the GAO called, quote, the growing use of overtime and augmentation. What are you doing to reduce overtime, and specifically the use of mandatory overtime?
Thank you, Congressman. As I said in my opening remarks, it wears and tears. As I walk through the halls of my institutions, while our correctional officers are so proud to tell me of the work that they're doing, they also share how exhausted they are, and it's driven by overtime and augmentation. So our focus to reduce that is hiring, is to get our institutions fully staffed. I just visited our facility in Michigan, Milan, Michigan, where it is nearly fully staffed, and just the tenor and tone of that institution was so different because they weren't buried with overtime and augmentation.
And would adjusting the pay scale or GS scale of correctional officers upward across the board be more advantageous to BOP in retaining staff and cost savings than paying millions of dollars in overtime?
Congressman, any way that we can pay our people more will actually, in the long run, cost less than overtime, yes.
Thank you. You have made it clear that you will not tolerate employee misconduct of any kind, and that this issue is among your highest priorities. What specific steps are you taking in this regard?
So many. This is something we've focused on out of the gate. When I first started as director 2 years ago, we had under 30 people who worked in our Office of Internal Affairs. We now have almost 150 individuals. We've realigned their reporting authority so they report directly to headquarters, not up through the warden, to remove any perceived or real barriers to that. We are working very closely with the Office of the Inspector General. I personally meet with him quarterly. Our teams meet regularly to ensure that the backlog and the communication is wide open there as well.
And in what way is the Department of Justice assisting your efforts to root out and address employee misconduct?
They've been incredibly helpful. The Deputy Attorney General herself and I have met directly with the U.S. attorneys to talk about the importance of prosecuting employee misconduct out of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They have been very receptive to that. I have met with U.S. attorneys regularly in the last 2 years, multiple times in the last 2 years, to share that very sentiment.
Thank you. In recent months, there have been a series of reports documenting BOP's continued widespread use of restrictive housing with devastating and deadly results. What steps is BOP taking to reduce the use of restrictive housing?
This is an area where we still have room for advancement. I have a long history of reforming restrictive housing. As I was talking to the union earlier, it's a tool we'll always have inside our institutions, but we need to limit it even more dramatically. It has dropped slightly since I started. Probably the biggest thing that we have in the works is we've been working very closely with the National Union to revise our policy around discipline for those in our custody. And as it is written right now, it reduces the sanction time in restrictive housing by almost 84%. So once that is passed, I think we'll see substantial
And what has
change.
BOP done to address the high rate of suicide in restrictive housing?
So we have mandated that individuals are double-celled in restrictive housing in order to ensure that they have human contact while they're in restrictive housing.
Thank you. Before becoming director of BOP, you often spoke about the harms of solitary confinement and the benefits of alternatives to the practice. What are the benefits that you see in alternatives to solitary confinement where people are separated from the general population but are provided real and effective out-of-cell programming and services?
Yeah, the research
Gentleman's
is,
time's expired, but you may go ahead and answer the question.
thank you, Mr. Chair. The research is very clear. The more normal and humane environments that we provide for the adults in custody, the safer they are, the less wear and tear on them as well as our employees. And so we have many alternatives to restrictive housing that we've engaged in over the last couple of years, including our step-down units, our reintegration units, our GROW units, which actually prevent people from actually going to restrictive housing. So we're taking lots of steps to see those numbers drop because we know very clearly the negative impacts of restrictive housing on those individuals.
Thank you, Director. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, I acknowledge that the gentleman from South Dakota. Oh, sorry about that.
I'm from
The
South
gentleman
Dakota.
from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong, would like to be waved on without objection. Seeing none. Okay. Chair now recognizes for his 5 minutes of questions. Gentleman from the chairman of the entire committee, from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the chairman. Director, how many federal inmates were released to home confinement under the CARES Act?
We had about 35,000 released under the CARES Act.
35,000?
Oh, excuse me, 35,000 is the number under FSA earned time credits. Under CARES Act, it was 13,000.
13, that's what I thought.
13,204.
13,000. On February 4th, 2023, Jason Galanis, after serving approximately 40% of his sentence, applied for home confinement. Very next month, the probation office approved that. You're familiar with that, right? Also, the very next month, March of 2023, the Pensacola warden approved. And then on June 9th, the Residential Reentry Management Center also approved Mr. Galanis for home confinement under the CARES Act. But then, 4 days later, the Board of Prisons denied it. Who made the decision to deny that?
The denial came out of the Residential Reentry Management Office.
After they approved it, 4 days later, they changed their mind?
So the chair and I spoke yesterday. I think there's some confusion around approvals and referrals. The warden has the ability to refer. Probation has the requirement to confirm that his housing option in the community is proper. That still doesn't approve a home confinement placement. The final decision rests with the Residential Reentry Management Office.
And they told Mr. Galanis on the 9th that everything was fine. And then on the 13th, they changed. Why?
That is not my understanding. The Residential Reentry Management Office did a thorough review of his case and concluded that he was, for a variety of indicators, would not be a good candidate for home confinement.
The Residential Reentry Management Center on June 9th approved Mr. Galanis' request for home confinement and then reached out to the Southern District of New York where he was prosecuted. Is that what happened?
That's not my understanding. My understanding is since he had more than 5 years on his sentence, it was practice for the Residential Reentry Management Office to reach out to the U.S.
Anyone
Attorney.
else get CARES Act release and home confinement under the CARES Act who had more than 5 years left on their sentence?
I can't answer that question
I can. David
definitively,
McMaster
but I
did.
can tell
David
you.
McMaster did. In sentence for fraud, similar to Mr. Galanis, had a 188-month sentence and was given home confinement under the CARES Act.
We look at each case individually. I am confident that
Okay,
Mr.
so
Galanis' case.
this is what I'm getting at. What was the reason, whether it was an approval then a denial, what was the reason for the denial?
So it was a handful of reasons, and we look at the totality of the circumstances when we make
When you
these
say
decisions.
we, who ultimately makes the decision? Does that rest with you?
No, sir. I do not review these.
Can you overrule it?
This is the residential.
Can you overrule what happens at the Residential Reentry Management Center?
I have never overruled one of their decisions.
Never. Okay. Then what were the factors that made this determination?
So the factors included the fact that in a previous incarceration cycle, he violated the conditions of his supervised release by texting a potential witness, and his bond was ultimately revoked. His role in the instant offense as a leader and organizer was outlined in the pre-sentencing report. As was mentioned earlier, he owed over $80 million in restitution. He had more than 10 victims and more than 5 years
How many
left
were
on his
turned down?
sentence.
The people who applied under the CARES Act, you gave approval to 13,204. How many were denied?
I don't have that number, but we're happy to look into it and get it back.
Is it a
to
big
the
number? Is it a
committee.
small number? What's the number?
You know, Congressman, I wouldn't venture a guess under oath. I will tell you that towards the end of CARES Act, the number of requests that came in, I'm told, tripled as the population learned that the CARES Act was expiring. So I know at the time of his request, the numbers were very high.
Did the fact that the House Oversight Committee subpoenaed Mr. Galanis' business partner have any weight on the decision to deny his request?
No.
You're confident of that?
I have no evidence to suggest that the Residential Reentry Management Office would have taken that into consideration. That would have been outside BOP policy.
Because June 9th, they basically told him, okay, it looks good. June 13th, they deny it. Anything happened in between there that could have influenced the decision?
Not that I am aware of.
Well, that's when the subpoena was sent to his business partner on June 12th. We actually think that probably had some impact on the decision to deny his request. Given that other people, similar crime, similar sentence, were in fact approved, like Mr. McMaster. And you're saying that had nothing to do with it?
Correct.
And you don't know how many were turned down?
No, but happy to find that number and get it back to you. In the
Were
committee.
I mean, Mr. Galanis is nonviolent, his crime is nonviolent. Any people who were in for a violent offense were then given release under the CARES Act?
Congressman, I am confident that Mr. Galanis' case was handled within existing BOP policy, and I am aware that any part of his application was denied other than the merits that I just described to you.
Okay. Well, the timeline doesn't seem to add up to what you just described there. I yield back.
Gentleman
Chair.
yields back. Yes.
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from DOJ explaining that Mr. Galanis was not eligible for home confinement under the CARES Act, consistent with department policy because of the length of time on his sentence and the nature of his conduct, which, as we know, involved conning shareholders, investors, and a tribal entity out of tens of millions of dollars.
Without objection. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Peters, thank you for being here today. December 21st, 2018, President Trump signed the First Step Act. And It was sentencing reform. I understand that mandatory sentences were reduced in some cases from 20 years to 15 years, depending on the crime, of course. Did you say that 35,000 people were released as a result of the First Steps Act?
That's correct.
The safety valve program, which also restricts or allows judges in nonviolent crimes to allow criminals, or at least people who have been convicted, a little earlier release, has that been helpful in lowering prison population and crowding?
You know, our prison population is continuing to climb ever so slightly, even though we have some of these tools at our disposal.
You know, in Alabama, I think we spoke about this last time. I'm a proponent of prison reform and certainly sentencing reform, and we have a prison in Alabama that actually teaches skills. And so when the inmates come out, they're certified welders, diesel mechanics, all the above. The recidivism rate has lowered dramatically, and so I always encourage us to look at those kind of programs. And concerning Mr. Galanis, I didn't realize that he had 8 business partners. I think Hunter Biden had 8 business partners, and Mr. Galanis was one of the 8 that got sentenced. Hunter did not get charged with anything, is my understanding. And that's the problem, I think, and we talked about this with Merrick Garland, is sometimes it seems like certain people, justice is not truly blind, and that's been a concern for us. And certainly with Mr. Galanis being a partner with Mr. Biden and us trying to get information concerning the impeachment process, you understand how we're concerned when he's denied after he's approved, and then all of a sudden we send a subpoena and they go, oh, by the way, you've been denied. Do you think in any way that sometimes politics gets into part of the prisons?
Congressman, no. We are to uphold the letter of the law and our policies, and politics should not be taken into account when we're making those decisions.
Well, under the First Step Act, which we just talked a little about, certain incarcerated individuals are meant to be able to earn time credits for participating in recidivism reduction programs. Our productive activities, which can be later applied towards early release, we've been informed by the BOP that it is not processing, or it is at this time it's not processing these earned credits, leaving inmates, including Jason Galanis, in the dark regarding his status through the First Step Act. What is the BOP doing to rectify the implementation of the First Step Act to ensure that individuals like Mr. Galanis are receiving proper treatment under the law?
So the automation of the earned time credits have proven very effective. It really allows for transparency with the adults in custody now. So now they know they have a projected date on if they stay in program, if they continue to engage in positive behavior, that those earned time credits are there.
So why aren't we keeping the prisoners in the dark on these? I think in some ways that's a carrot that we can say, hey, you're at this point, we could move you along a little, you're making great progress. I mean, we always want to encourage folks who are trying to make the effort to correct their path. Any reason why we're keeping certain inmates or inmates in dark on this?
Congressman, you and I are aligned on this. I'm a behaviorist by training, and it's absolutely a carrot, which is why we have changed the practice now. So now they're not in the dark. Now we're doing the automated projective earned time credits, and they're able to see that carrot, if you will.
When did y'all begin that?
We have been working on automated time credits for over a year, and it's been in the last few months that we've been doing the projected earned time credits.
Okay, to your knowledge, based on participation in these programs facilitated under the First Step Act, First Step Act, how many earned credits does Mr. Galanis, how much has he accumulated?
I do not have that answer, but we're happy to look into it and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Chair now recognizes Representative Dean.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you, Representative McBath, for your leading role here. In the absence of our colleague, I just want to take a couple seconds to also offer my thoughts and sympathy, especially to Sheila Jackson Lee's family and her staff, her able staff, both here and in Houston. I feel so lucky that I had the chance to serve with her for 5.5 years on this committee and on this subcommittee on crime. What a force, the hardest working woman in Congress. Everybody knows that. There wasn't an issue she didn't speak about. So she is already dearly missed, but her 30 years will live on for a long time. And if I could begin. Thank you very much, Director Peters, for being here. The BOP reports that 45% of federal prisoners have mental health or behavioral problems. More than 30% struggle with substance use disorder. That's in line with what I have heard when I was state representative in Pennsylvania, and when I've spoken to Secretary Laurel Harry of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, she estimated that roughly 35% of the people within her care struggle with mental health. At least 15% suffer from serious mental health problems. And she said a majority, perhaps as high as 70%, grapple with addiction, substance use disorder. Clearly, our inmates need comprehensive support because they are coming home. They will re-enter our society, and we want that to be as successful as possible for them, for their families, and also to reduce recidivism. So, addiction and mental health. What are the top things that the Bureau is doing or can do, especially if you had the resources, to aid inmates with mental health issues and substance use?
Thank you, Congressman. You're absolutely right, and the numbers that you mentioned reflect what's in my recall. A large number of individuals suffer from mental health issues and alcohol and drug addictions. Many of those are drivers to incarceration.
Yes.
And so it's really our job to focus on getting them healthy, both physically and mentally, before they come back and become our good neighbors. So all of our institutions have doctoral level psychiatrists, or psychologists, and we have 500 psychologists and approximately 600 treatment specialists across the country who focus on this alone, as well as residential and non-residential alcohol and drug treatment.
I appreciate that. You talked, especially in your testimony, about recruitment, retention. By way of staffing, how many staffers are you down? And then I'm wondering, has there been any attempt in terms of compensation, attempted special pay increases for staff, for example, that we should know about because of our appropriations role and responsibility? So staffing, how much are you down, and what do you need in terms of appropriations and any special pay?
Great. So I'll start with the money. As I said in my opening comments, we paid over $128 million last year in recruitment and retention incentives alone. And we're working with the department and OPM specifically on a special salary rate because, as I've said before, these incentives are Band-Aids only. The bottom line is our employees are not getting paid enough. And so a special salary rate is really the long-term fix.
What does that look like? What would a special salary rate look like?
We estimate needing an additional $600 million a year to have that salary rate accepted and have a competitive salary with other law enforcement agencies and the private sector.
Okay. And is that what is meant by a special pay increase? Is that what you're...
Special salary rate, that's correct.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
And we're asking for all of the employees in our institutions.
And in terms of staffing, under the previous administration, how many staff members did you lose?
That 2016 number keeps coming up. It was around 6,000, I believe, but what we've really focused on is the fact that even though we have positional authority right now, we're not able to fill them all. And so you asked about what was funded, or excuse me, what is authorized and what is filled. We have over 20,000 authorized in the correctional officer series, but if you look at boots on the ground, those correctional officers that you think of managing the units, we have about 14,900 authorized, and only 83% of those are filled. We also had a contractor come in and do an assessment to figure out going forward how many do we need to safely operate our institutions, and they're telling us we need an additional 4,000 correctional officers, another 2,500 healthcare professionals, and they're going to complete their analysis this fall on the other employees that are working inside our institutions.
Thank you for your leadership, and I hope we, those who appropriate the money for the Bureau, for your tireless staff, actually hear those words and meet the moment.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would yield my 5 minutes to the distinguished member and future governor of the state of North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you. Where are you from in South Dakota?
Millbank.
Oh, fantastic.
So not far from your border.
90% of the people who are in custody in the federal system will be released.
That's correct.
I mean, that's why we're here, and that is why it's important. And you inherited a mess. I mean, you inherited a mess. But we walked through, and I think And there's not a lot of great stories over the last 5 years, but I think there are some, and I think it can also help. The CARES Act recidivism rate was 3.7%. That's roughly 10% of BOP at large. And it's statistically no different than traditional home confinement. Is that, are my numbers accurate? I mean,
the recidivism rate for CARES Act was about 4.4% is what I have, yes.
So, and recidivism rate for First Step Act is about 35 to 37% lower than the BOP at large.
That's correct.
So, I mean, these programs work. And I think, so when we're talking about staffing, and I'm gonna ask about the OPM salary thing in a second, because there's another side to this, right? What percentage of people who you hire are gone within the first year? Do you know?
You know, I don't have that number, but it is an area of concern because we were able to onboard in 2022, but we onboarded fewer than left. So the good news for this year so far is that we've onboarded 1,400 and it's more than have left.
And I appreciate you saying you support the BOP oversight bill because it's not often we have somebody in here. I mean, there's some strict measures in there. You talked about augmentation and all of those different issues. But if you're hitting overtime at 5 o'clock on Wednesday and you're committed to working another 2 hours a week and you have 2 kids at home that you haven't seen and you're working in a dilapidated facility and people have to be locked up all weekend because you don't have enough staff to get them in there, you know what that creates? Well, one, it's a terrible working environment outside of the pay, and that exists. It also creates recidivism. And there are things the federal system does really well, and one of them is pretrial release. It's fascinating to me because it's almost counterintuitive. It's less confrontational, more rehabilitative, life choice skills, all of those different things. The problem is nothing you get taught in pretrial release, you remember 10 years later when you get a 10-year minimum mandatory. And some of it is geographical, but one of the things the federal prison system I don't think does very well, and I think we have an opportunity to increase on it, is reentry. The tools for reentry, we have a bill with David Trone just to give everybody a BOP ID, like to set up a bank account or to buy a bus ticket or to get home. And so when we're talking about the First Step implementation, we talk about what happens when they get out. But what are you guys doing to implement, and this becomes more important because a lot of times people are not incarcerated locally. So what are you doing to meeting the good time credits and outside of staffing, because I'm assuming staffing is a challenge to this, what are you doing to increase the ability of the people who qualify for video calls with family, telephone calls with family, all of those different issues? Because we know, and the data supports, the more you do that, the less likely they're gonna reoffend when they get out.
So you covered so much there. So
I would
of
take
course,
everybody's
as the
time.
director of BOP and as the former Inspector General of the good state of Oregon, of course I support the Oversight Act. I understand the important role of the Inspector General, and he and I work closely. As it relates to release IDs, I've met with Congressman Trone many times. I'm proud to report to the committee that all BOP facilities now have the ability to issue an ID, so individuals are actually leaving. In fact, since December of 2023, we've generated over 6,500 release cards. As you well know, that's an incredible barrier to reentry. And as it relates to staffing inside our institutions, when I walk the halls of our institutions, and we have great representatives from the union here in the room, they're exhausted. They tell me exactly the anecdotal stories that you just shared, that the families have pickup times figured out and who's cooking figured out, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons messes it up regularly because of mandated overtime.
We want to hold people accountable.
Yes.
We want them to serve their sentence.
Yes.
But ideally, we'd prefer when they get out, they don't reoffend again right away.
That's right.
That is the officer safety. So, and this is for everybody. This is the only adult population that the federal government is in charge of everything.
Right.
Like, we have taken care, custody, and control of them. So and whether it's a facility and everybody looks at it and says, I don't care what kind of room violent criminals in, but the employees do. And if you're working in something that's 30 years old and all across it, all of that, and if we don't retain employees, because it's not just the number of employees, it's how many years experience they have. And that is the single best way to deliver all of the things we need to deliver and also ensure safe and secure society. With that, I yield back. I'm sorry.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Director Peters, thank you for coming. But before I talk to you, I'd like to just reflect a few of my thoughts about Chairman Jackson Lee. We sat together for nearly the entire 18 years I've been here, side by side in Judiciary Committee. She came to Memphis for a hearing. We had a field hearing and supported me. And I went to Houston and supported her. She was a dynamic figure who was one of a kind. She was a force, and she was a force that soaked up as much information as she could to help her people and justice as she saw it, and did a marvelous job in Congress, and she will certainly be missed. She was something else. Director Peters, let me ask you this. I've not caught a lot of the hearings, so if I'm asking anything that's been asked before, just let me know that. Following up on the governor's questions, what does a person get when they're released from prison right now? They're talking about this card. What's such a big deal about giving somebody a card?
It's such a big deal because it's a barrier to so many things, to getting a bank account when you get out, to being able to show a formal ID, to rent an apartment.
Oh, I can see that
yeah.
they need it, but why is it such a problem to give it to them?
It's been a barrier on so many levels because the way that individuals get IDs when they get into the community is to the Department of Motor Vehicles. But if you've been incarcerated for a while, you might not have that Social Security card, you might not have that birth certificate. And so now the Federal Bureau of Prisons employees spends time sleuthing and getting those documents so that they do have them when they leave, and then they also have an official ID that is being accepted in 26 states as these individuals come back into our communities.
And then when they leave the prison system, are they just taken out the prison doors and released, or are they given transportation back home? How does that handle?
So the majority of them not only receive transportation, but they receive transportation to a residential reentry center or to home confinement. So I think the ability to take people who are still serving a sentence and have a step down for them in the community really proves beneficial, so that they have a safe environment to try to reenter, but with wraparound services around them.
Once they leave the Bureau of Prisons and they go to these programs which are available to them, Bureau of Prisons is totally out. Y'all don't have any, you don't give them any money to have an opportunity to buy some things when they get out, or any credits?
We encourage people to save money on their account for reentry purposes, and but when they're in the residential reentry center or on home confinement, they're still sentenced to the Bureau, so they're still under our custody, which is why it's a great step down. It isn't until their sentence expires that then we hand them off to pretrial for supervision. Or probation for supervision.
On Saturday, I went to Payne's Barbecue in Memphis, and a man came up to me, and after shaking my hand for the longest period of time I've ever had my hand shaken, big man. Anyway, he came up to me afterwards at lunch, and he said, I just spent 15 years in the federal system, and I want to start a reentry program. How does somebody start a reentry program for federal prisoners?
So they would be able to reach out to our procurement staff and be able to share kind of what their reentry idea is, and our procurement staff would be able to point them in the right direction.
So they go to the Federal Correctional Facility in Memphis?
No, I would refer them to our procurement staff at headquarters.
Okay, okay. They need something, and Representative Armstrong was getting close to it, and the idea that they just can't leave them there. They need help, and so they don't commit crimes when they're released. Has there been any privatization of any federal services, prisons?
So we had engaged in 11 contracts with private prisons, but based on the President's executive order, we no longer engage in any of those contracts.
I'm not for private prisons. I think it's the government's responsibility. A lot of states have done it. What's been your experience with private prisons?
So I'm previously the director of the Oregon Department of Corrections, and that was actually statutorily prohibited in Oregon, so it wasn't something I was familiar with there. And then, of course, the executive order was in place when I arrived in this role, and we successfully complied with the executive order's time frame and ended those contracts.
Thank you. Compassionate release, that's a program I've been interested in as well. What have you done to streamline the compassionate release program and get more people that are old as hell, who are not going to be able to or want to commit a crime again, out of the system and home?
The gentleman's time's expired, but you may answer the question.
Thank you. Then, in the interest of time, I'll say I think the most prominent expansion that we've engaged in this last year has been to be able to include confirmed victims of sexual assault inside our institutions for compassionate release. That was part of the U.S. sentencing guidelines changes.
Say victims of sexual assault? Okay.
Confirmed victims of sexual assault on our watch that they're now able to apply for. And then I think it's important for the committee to understand I can recommend to the courts for compassionate release, but that decision ultimately rests with the courts. But I think that's a really important expansion of compassionate release that we've engaged in this last year.
If I may, with
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Good Lord.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Peters, thank you for your work as Director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The people you house in your facilities are there for a limited period before they re-enter society. And as someone who believes that everyone deserves a second chance, that is what I am most interested in. So I want to jump right in and ask you about how well the prison system is working when it comes to rehabilitation and reentry. I believe it's imperative that we equip inmates with the tools they need to succeed on the outside. Doing that will help them be engaged, productive members of society, and it is what will keep them from entering or recidivism. Can you please talk about the programs that you have inside the prison walls that help with rehabilitation, and do you have enough staffing and resources to run these programs effectively?
So we have over 115 evidence-based recidivism reduction programs now, and as I walk the halls of our institutions, there's a lot of creativity about even expanding those. So everything from mental health treatment to alcohol and drug treatment to anger management to cognitive behavioral therapy, residential alcohol and drug programs, non-residential, so a plethora of programs. We believe at the Bureau that the conversation around reentry begins on day one to get them prepared to become those good neighbors, as you say. Do we have enough staff? No. Are they being paid enough? No.
I was proud that the bipartisan First Step Act was signed into law back in 2018, which contained both sentencing and prison reforms aimed at recidivism reduction. It's the most significant bipartisan criminal justice reform legislation in a generation. And as you know, the First Step Act provides that those serving sentences have the opportunity to earn good time credits for participating in recidivism reduction programs and related activities. And for qualifying low-level offenders, those time credits will result in early release. And also there are other changes to the good times credit the good time credit calculation. There are some other things in the First Step Act about that, having to do with when the sentence was first commenced. Can you talk about how you calculate those earned time credits for persons who were in prison at the time the First Step Act passed?
Yes, so originally when the First Step Act passed, it was a manual calculation, which caused a lot of labor and a lot of confusion amongst the population. So we have now automated the earned time credits. And just recently, in the previous months, not only have we automated the earned time credits, we're actually projecting out what their release date might be, as we talked about earlier, as a carrot, so that people understand if they continue to engage in programming and treatment, if they continue to have good conduct inside the institution, then they know what their earliest release could be. You mentioned how many people are released and the recidivism rate. Under the First Step Act, we've already released over 35,000 individuals with a recidivism rate of just 9.7%. So you're correct, it is working.
Thank you. What actions has BOP taken to ensure that risk and needs assessments are conducted as required and that there are sufficient evidence-based recidivism recidivism reduction programs available to meet the needs of all incarcerated people?
Yes, so we have over 150 evidence-based recidivism reduction programs and productive activities right now, and we are working to expand those every day. As I walk the halls of our institutions, the creativity that I'm seeing around advancing additional programs is great. I mentioned earlier that I just visited our prison in Milan, Michigan, which happens to have the only federal prison with a high school inside of it, so you can get not just a GED, but a high school diploma. They had over 15 apprenticeship programs at that one facility. And so people are taking, we say the First Step Act is part of who we are, part of our daily life now, and you see that when you walk the halls of our institutions.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Lee. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. Director Peters, thank you for being here with us today and for your testimony about your work with the Bureau of Prisons. The last time you were here with us, one of the things that we discussed were the conditions at FCI Dublin and the incidents of the abuse of female prisoners. And you shared with us your plans to ensure that oversight and accountability were brought to that facility. And of course, since that time, the facility has been closed. Would you share with us more about your efforts in that regard and where the women who were housed at FCI Dublin are now?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So as we spoke previously, we poured so many resources into that institution in hopes that it would succeed. Additional staffing, additional incentives, additional psychologists, trauma-informed training, gender-responsive training. We changed the executive team 3 times over, and unfortunately concluded that it still was not meeting expectations, so we temporarily closed it. We did move individuals to other female facilities. For those individuals that had less than 5 months on their sentence, we moved them to CTAC, our facility in Washington, to ensure that they were as close as they could be to family. Others have been distributed throughout the country at other female facilities.
You also mentioned earlier some of the changes that you've made internally to increase accountability and prosecutions for those who do commit these types of violent acts against people who are in custody. Specifically, you touched on a very large increase in the number of people assigned to internal affairs and changing the reporting process to not go through a warden, but instead go straight to headquarters. Would you give us a summary of your assessment? Are those changes working? Were the people who committed these crimes at FCI Dublin held to account? Would you share with us your perspective on what has been done to ensure this type of treatment of female inmates doesn't reoccur?
I think it starts exactly where you're at, employee accountability. And for the record, I'd like to say the supermajority of our employees come to work every day doing the right thing, are ethical, and are as disappointed as you and I are when people engage in this type of egregious misconduct. So the realignment that you talk about, the additional staff that we brought on is working. We've closed, since August of 22, when I started, we've closed over 9,500 open matters in the Office of Internal Affairs. We have seen more prosecutions. There are still investigations pending out of Dublin. We may see more. I've worked very closely with the U.S. attorneys, as has the Deputy Attorney General, to ensure that they're prosecuting these cases. The importance of holding people accountable is so important. And then we've done so many other things. We work closely with the Inspector General, who is engaged in unannounced visits. The Office of the Deputy Attorney General has created safer teams that have now visited every single one of our female facilities. We've done cultural assessments now at all of our female facilities to see if we can see warning signs, so we don't ever get to a place again where we have a culture that is as egregious as the one at Dublin. And as I mentioned earlier, I am pleased with the passage of the Oversight Act, which will shepherd forward more announced and unannounced visits from the Inspector General, because I truly believe we can't do this work alone.
And I was interested in exactly that point. What about the Federal Prison Oversight Act? Do you believe that there are provisions in there that are going to be specifically impactful? Of course, I am very pleased to see it pass the House, pass the Senate. Are there provisions there that you think will help prevent further abuse of women who are in custody?
I do, because the Act really enhances what's already happening with the Office of the Inspector General. It just allows for more of it. The unannounced visits, using data to look at any concerns that we have so that we can see a culture change before it gets into a more difficult place. So we'll be seeing more announced visits, more unannounced visits from the Inspector General. And then I think the Ombudsman position is very powerful as well, to have a place where individuals can bring forward complaints and somebody there to ensure that those complaints are asked and answered.
What about women in custody who are feeling threatened or are in danger? What options do they have to ensure that their concerns are heard and that they are kept safe?
So I think it's our obligation to create a culture where they feel safe coming forward, and that's one of the things that we really work on with our trauma-informed care and our gender responsivity. But they have the right to come forward to any employee that they feel safe talking to. They also have the ability to contact the Inspector General through anonymous channels to be able to report any complaints or concerns that they have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questions. Director, I've received certain reports that more than 60,000 First Step Act eligible inmates in the system face significant delays in their pre-release to a halfway house or final release to freedom because there's not full compliance, or you haven't been able to fully comply with the First Step Act yet. And there are estimates that these delays range from 3 to 6 to even as much as 12 months depending on the length of sentence, which may be costing the taxpayer as much as $5 billion according to estimates. So I'm going to ask you today, do those numbers sound accurate to you? Are they accurate?
I'd want to confirm with my team on the accuracy of those numbers, but anecdotally, that is what I'm hearing when I walk the institutions. There's a lot of frustration with the adult in custody population about them already qualifying for an RRC, and we simply don't have the capacity in the community. And so you're raising a very important point. The Residential Reentry Center program was created before FSA. Before FSA, people would spend weeks or months in an RRC. Now they qualify for months and years in a residential reentry center. And so we are at capacity. Right now, my team is assessing what that future need will be in terms of resources for residential reentry centers.
So there's been a long promised but much delayed conditional maximum FTC calculator within. What's the delay on that? Is that happening? When can we anticipate that? Is there a way for you to commit? I'd like you to commit to get that up and running within the next 60 days. Tell me what's going on with that, please.
So, Congressman, that was the case. It's now the earned time calculator,
Right.
the earned time credit
Projected
calculator.
earned time credit calculator. Right.
It's fully operational. Any errors that we're hearing about now are because of human input into the system, not because the earned time credit calculator is broken. And then just recently, in the last few months, we have expanded the earned time credit calculator to do a full-on projection so that people can see if they behave in prison, if they stay in programming and treatment, their earliest release date is X.
So thank you for that, and I'm going to leave that topic for a second, and we can maybe talk more about that later offline. We've requested a number of items of information and requested some recorded, transcribed interviews with the guard in Pensacola and the two wardens in Pensacola related to the Galanis case. We've not been able to have those interviews yet, and I want, before we finish today, I want to ask you for that commitment, but there's also a series of other items, and I'm going to run through those real quickly. We requested and subpoenaed information on the following. We received less than fulsome responses to some of them. The policies, procedures, and communications regarding Galanis' application for CARES Act home confinement. We received a little bit on that. We expect more. All coordination between staff members of BOP and the U.S. Attorney's Office for Southern District of New York and DOJ in that case. Again, the information regarding the allegations of sexual assault and sexual harassment perpetrated against Galanis by a BOP staff member. And then I want to ask you, and then there's several other things, and I'll get to those in a second if I've got time. But I want to ask you, are you aware of the requirements of the Prison Rape Elimination Act? I'm sure you are.
Yes.
And what is the standard operating procedure of the Bureau for when an inmate reports being sexually assaulted by BOP personnel?
So we take all allegations of sexual assault very seriously. They're referred to the Office of Internal Affairs, and if there's any suspicion of criminal misconduct, it's referred to the Office of the Inspector General.
So is the only procedure at that point is a referral to IA? Is that the
OIA,
or
and
OIA?
then OIG.
But there's no immediate movement of that personnel from one area to
Oh,
another?
yes, there absolutely could be, yes.
That's why I
yes.
want that as well, please.
Yes, so we do an assessment around safety, both for the victim, safety for the victim and safety for other individuals in the institution.
So how quickly is that like for the inmate to be removed from the facility?
I think it's common practice for the victim to be moved in short order, or the employee moved in short order.
So when you say short order, what are we talking about?
Sometimes it could be immediate, Congressman.
And let's see here, I want to see here. There was a judge in Kansas, my time's expired, but I'm going to send you some written questions as well, okay, that we're going to want answers to, because I want to respect everyone's time here. So I'll send you some written questions, but I would, again, get back to the less than fulsome answers we received on the request for documents and answers that we've sent. And Director, I would ask that you get your team on that right away so we get that information in. And appreciate you being here today. And with that, this committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, members.